So over the years, we've talked about and covered development kits from past generations. We've covered the Nintendo DS with the Nitro emulator. We covered the Sony PSP. So this is the original Xbox DVT-4 development kit. This is the tool that most developers would use on their desks when they were making games for the original Xbox. Now there's also the green Xbox debug kit that is also suitable for making games on. But generally speaking, they were more test kits that were in the hands of testers and systems that were used at things like trade shows, for example. As you can see, this pretty much is a one-to-one match of a retail development kit, other than the case itself representing more of a crystal Xbox style, but the actual shell itself is quite different than a crystal Xbox. And you can see that the amount of size here has been raised a little bit more. It's a little taller than the original Xbox when you put them side by side. But otherwise, you can see here that we've got the same 4 controller ports on the front. We've got the power button and the eject button. We still have a DVD drive here. And obviously we have the words development kit etched onto the right-hand side. Now the top jewel is a little different than the original Xbox's jewel. It is a little different in terms of color. The green is a little bit lighter, but for all intents and purposes, this is pretty much the same Xbox in terms of form factor as an original Xbox. But what's interesting about the journey that these development kits took was they weren't always looking like this. The earliest models, the beta models, the alpha models, the DVT-1s, had more of a PC design where they were essentially just a PC with PCI slots. And those systems are very much sought after and rare to find. Something like this is still pretty much sought after by collectors, but you can find these, on forums out there. There are people that tend to sell these things. Now, with any old development kit out there, most of the time they've come from a studio, and usually the studio itself is no longer around. They've been shut down, or they've been bought out, or they've just gone under, they've been liquidated, or whatever. And collectors usually like to get a hold of these systems for their collection. There's obviously a lot of fans out there of the Xbox, and there are people out there that have the entire set of Xbox systems and variants out there. So something like this to a collector is quite interesting. It's also something that hobbyists that want to make homebrew for the OG Xbox or mess around with from a software perspective could get some value from something like this. But I will also add that you don't need a development kit. You don't need an Xbox development kit to make Xbox games or make Xbox homebrew. There are other ways to do that. In fact, you can turn a retail Xbox into a development kit, albeit with some limitations. Now, when we turn the system around, there's a few interesting things that are going on here that a original Xbox retail system doesn't have. You've got your power connector here for your AC power into the wall. You've got your standard Xbox video connector here, and you've got your Ethernet jack. So all those things are present on a retail Xbox, and that's all you'll get on a normal Xbox on a retail system. But you can see here we've got some extras here, some add-ons. The first one here is a serial port. This is a RS-232 port that, if you are someone that used serial back in the day, get a pretty good understanding of what this is. But essentially what this allows for is connectivity to a computer via a serial program to allow for kernel debugging. Now, why would that be important? Well, when you're making games for the original Xbox, and in any real capacity at the time, when you would make games, sometimes you would experience some crashing, maybe at a kernel level, and you weren't really quite sure why that would happen. Maybe your code was bad, but you didn't really know what had gone wrong. The kernel debugger offers another level of debugging at the kernel level to say something went wrong in this part of the kernel, and it's because this piece of code that you wrote had messed it up. So this particular connector is unique to a Xbox development kit. It's not available on the debug kit. Now the second connector here is quite unique. This is for DVD emulation. So on a PC, there was what was known as a Raptor XDK PCI card. When you plug that into a computer, The goal of this was to test a master disk before sending it to Microsoft. Now, getting a master disk prepared took a little bit of time, and it was something that you really had to get right because it was very important to group your files together when you pressed a disk before you pressed a disk. Otherwise, you could be in a situation where you had some significant loading times. And the goal really was to have as little loading as possible and as fast as loading as possible when it came to DVD drives, which are notoriously slow, as we know. Now, the third connector here is actually blocked off, but this is a standard USB output connector. And from what I believe, the main goal of this was to connect it up to a JVS system for arcade games. Remember, the original Xbox also powered arcade games like Virtual Cop 3 and Outrun 2 Coast to Coast, just to name a couple. There were some others as well. And the arcade hardware that was based on the Xbox motherboard was known as Chihiro. So this USB was really a simple way to access a JVS setup, so this Xbox could then be tested as a dev kit for Sega Chihiro games. At least that's my understanding. Now, someone may tell me that that may not be 100% accurate. Now, on the previous DVT-3 model, which pretty much looks exactly the same as this model here, this is the DVT-4, this port was actually open. So Microsoft at some point decided that they would close off this port to developers to get access to, which is interesting to really think about. So looking at the underside of this dev kit, we can see that we've got these two prototype stickers here. Now, on the DVT-4, there were prototypes, which is what I have, and there was also final. So you may end up having a sticker that says final on yours, but this one is a earlier prototype model of the DVT-4. Now, I also mentioned that the dev kit probably came from a studio that's no longer around. And as you can see, there is a Vivendi Universal sticker on this particular dev kit. And of course, every dev kit that's out there isn't really your property. It belongs to the manufacturer, the hardware manufacturer, in this case, Microsoft. So you can see here, there is a sticker here that says MS Equipment. So Microsoft, if you're watching this, don't try to collect my prototype Xbox. I mean, it's been way too long now, so don't come after me. So let's go ahead and power on the Xbox. We've got it all plugged in here into our modern display, and we're using a RetroTink 5X for those people that are wondering. And when you turn on an Xbox dev kit, you get the same intro animation as you would with a retail system. But once you launch into it, you get what's known as the XDK launcher. Now, as with most development hardware, the Xbox XDK is very similar in that it does not actually load any commercial games. It won't play any commercial games. So I'm just putting in a copy of Bloodwake into the drive here, and the Xbox development kit won't actually read the disk at all. But just like most modding communities, hacking communities out there, there's been some patches that can be applied to the XDK to read a commercial game. So this is something that can be solved, but out of the box, as you can see, it's not even recognizing the disk. Even though it has read the disk in the drive, there is no way that you can play commercial games on a development kit, and that's pretty standard when it comes to dev kits.
Internally, the DVT-4 motherboard is practically identical to a retail Xbox, but it has the inclusion of an extra 64 megabytes soldered onto the motherboard for a total of 128 megabytes of RAM, double a retail system, of course. Now, offering a development kit that for the most part used the same hardware as a retail Xbox was both a blessing and a curse for Microsoft. The great part was manufacturing costs of dev kits would not be significant, but on the other hand, it was quickly discovered that during the Xbox modding days that it was simply possible to reflash a retail Xbox with a debug BIOS from a development kit and convert that retail Xbox into a dev kit. Of course, you would not get the entire feature set and you would lose 64 megabytes of memory, but many homebrew emulators and apps were developed either on official dev hardware or on converted retail units. It was pretty simple to do. Of course, the main use of a dev kit is to make games. Developers would work on their PC and they would use Visual Studio 2003 with the Microsoft SDK installed. This was essentially an add-on module that provided the tools to write and deploy codes to target the Xbox dev kit over the Ethernet. This idea of remote debugging is pretty common when it comes to development hardware. The Xbox dev kit, however, was very easy to set up. And I guess this is because Microsoft owned every piece of the toolchain. The OS, usually Windows 2000 or XP, Visual Studio, and the Xbox hardware. Overall, it's quite easier to set up and use. The original Xbox was Microsoft's first foray into game consoles, and we'll take a closer look at an Xbox 360 development kit on the channel in a future episode, which would contain some notable differences over retail hardware. But for now, that will do it for this episode. I do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.